Today, with a new fellowship gathering and location, we start a series into the mysterious private briefing Jesus gave to his disciples. This is the most thrilling, exciting, and controversial message Jesus ever gave. It's a chapter that records details of our future. It's the longest recorded answer Jesus gave to any question, which should help you prioritize the importance of this message. Luke records a similar message in his 21st chapter, as does Mark in his 13th chapter. It turns out the three synoptic gospels record snippets of two back-to-back but slightly different briefings. The conversation started within the temple itself, with the Luke narrative taking place in the temple area, starting with the witnessing of the two mites from the widow. A much larger audience was in attendance at this point. Matthew and Mark record details that begin as they are leaving the temple area, with the majority of the information imparted to just the four inner circle disciples. After they sit atop the Mount of Olives, Luke records none of the Mount of Olives discussion. It's important to identify Jesus spoke different specific details in two separate conversations. Most Christians miss this detail. One public briefing as he journeyed through the temple, and a second, more detailed private briefing to his four closest disciples. My recommendation, before commencing a study in the Olivet Discourse, read all 4 chapters in one sitting. So your background reading is Matthew 24 and 25, Mark 13, and Luke 21. This is the most highly contentious of all of Jesus' teachings. It has led to countless millions of arguments amongst Christians. There are some things in the text we can know for sure, and we can be confident we fully understand and comprehend. But it's critical to be humble in this passage and admit there are some things we're speculating on. I'll do my best to distinguish between things we're certain about and things we're theorizing about. I've heard many theories stated in fact form, which turn out to be false. For example, the booklet 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988 was born from a misinterpretation from the Olivet Discourse. Any teacher who set a rapture date, I'd strongly advise you to stop listening to them. They're a dangerous false teacher. Let's all steer well clear of rapture date setters and do something worthwhile. Turn together to Matthew 24 verse 1. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. As I mentioned, the Matthew narrative commences as they depart the temple. Only Luke records the temple conversation with similar but divergent content. His broader collection of disciples point out to Jesus the impressive temple complex. Herod the Great was a wicked man, but he was a superb architectural visionary. The temple of Jesus' day was rebuilt in spectacular fashion. The courtyard and outer buildings were beautiful to behold. The enormous outer defensive walls were an example of brilliant and cutting-edge engineering. Experts today can only guess at how Herod and his building team were able to bring together these massive 500-ton hewn stone blocks, perfectly fit together, that made up these incredible outer defensive walls. From a human perspective, it's easy to understand why these disciples were so impressed by these Jerusalem buildings. We need to gain an appropriate appreciation of their perspective to begin to understand why they're talking about the central Jerusalem buildings and what would drive them to ask the questions they're about to ask. You see, for centuries, the Jews had been longing for the coming of their Messiah. They're well read in their Hebrew prophets. They know what Daniel wrote, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the rest. They've sung psalms for generations about the coming of their deliverer. God has made them unconditional promises. They've suffered for centuries under foreign oppression, Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Grecian, now Roman tyranny. That he would set them free was the promise they held to. God had promised many times through ancient prophets that their deliverer was coming, their Messiah, the one who would set them free, that the Christ would bring them dignity, freedom, peace, shalom. The very Hebrew greeting was a remembrance of this promise. And now that Messiah was among them, surely shalom would shortly arrive. And to their mind, they're expecting Jesus as the Messiah to take command and control of this city and its buildings. This is what you'll take command of, Jesus. We can't wait. When are we taking over? They may even have been eyeing off which buildings they'd take residence in. Verse 2, and Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." This surely would have deflated the disciples. It seems this shocking prediction ends the conversation. Jesus wasn't intending to take immediate charge of the city. They were stuck on carnal thoughts, carnal things, carnal ambitions. And Jesus is not willing to play ball. He's been with them, teaching them for 3 years. And yet, here they are focused on temporary, earthly, carnal things, rather than having a heavenly, spiritual perspective, looking to things of eternal consequence. And we Christians can easily fall into this exact same trap. We can spend most of our time dealing with carnal things, earthly things, work, family, gathering wealth, earth-focused, rather than devoting our precious time to spiritual matters, reading the Word, studying the Word, prayer, gathering and fellowshipping with the saints, sharing the gospel, shining God's light in a dark world, being spiritual salt in a tasteless world. Verse 3, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Having now reached their destination, Mark confirms that Peter, James, John, and Andrew are the disciples who now privately put 3 questions to Jesus. Firstly, when? When is the temple going to be pulled down? They'd heard Jesus speak cryptically about pulling down the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days. But there was nothing cryptic about what Jesus had just said to them. This is unthinkable, Jesus. But you said it plainly. You said it clearly this time, and we know you meant it. When will this happen? Secondly, what will be the sign of your coming? From our perspective, we read this as a question relating to his second coming. But it's unlikely this is the perspective from which they pose the question. They're not expecting Jesus to leave the earth and return in a second coming many centuries into the future. Your coming for them is simply how long? How long, Jesus, till you take charge? Are you about to do it now? Or is it still a few years away? And the final question about the end of the age. Well, of course, once Messiah takes command, the prior age is complete. This to them automatically meant they'd enter a new age of Messiah's rule. And they were quite right with this assumption. Once Jesus comes again, we will enter a new age, the millennial age of Messiah. Notice, Jesus doesn't correct their question. He doesn't tell them, there'll be no time of my rule on earth. He doesn't tell them, the Jews will never live in peace and safety in the promised land. He doesn't tell them, never is there going to be a day as all Jews hope. Because this day is coming for the Jews, but not in the time frame the disciples were expecting. Some people teach that Jesus in the Matthew 24 Hilltop private briefing doesn't address the first question. That is, when will the temple be pulled down, Jesus? But that he only addresses the second and third question, with the Luke 21 narrative answering this first question. I personally believe Jesus answers all 3 questions. In a nutshell, these things will all happen during the day of the Lord, around the time of the second coming, including the complete dismantling of the temple complex that will be rebuilt before the second coming. And I believe a new and more impressive millennial temple will replace the desolated tribulation temple. I believe even the few remaining foundation stones Herod put in place will be removed before the millennium. I believe a complete demolition and redesign of Jerusalem will occur, where the blueprints at the end of Ezekiel for the temple complex and a reorganized Jerusalem will be implemented. Verse 4, and Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. We've got the benefit of 2,000 years of hindsight. But keep in mind, they had no inkling that Jesus was planning on departing and leaving them. They had no notion that Jesus was going to wait over 2,000 years to fulfill these predictions and set up his earthly kingdom. Jesus, with these words, is telling them he was indeed leaving them, and he'd be gone for a very long time, long enough for people to forget what he looked like. And in some distant day, he'd return again. In the interim, many others would come pretending to be him, the Messiah. Many will even be fooled into believing this deception. Verse 6, and you will hear of wars and rumours of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Wars and rumours of wars, and not just nation against nation, but kingdom against kingdom. With these words, Jesus is telling the disciples the time of Messiah's rule is way off down the track. When Jesus? His answer hints, not for a very long time. Rome was the undisputed world superpower. There was no kingdom rising against Rome in the first century. Rome dominated the entire Mediterranean region for centuries. The disciples were expecting a revolution in the next few days, and Jesus is squashing their hopes and their dreams. These beginning of sorrow signs are the key marker point that draws a line of distinction between the Matthew and Luke accounts. These beginning of sorrow signs are in both the Matthew and Luke accounts, and they also turn up in Revelation 6. Matthew will immediately go on to talk about events that take place after these signs, and Luke goes on to talk about events that happen before the beginning of sorrow signs. See Luke 21:12, which says specifically, but before all these things. And then Luke goes on to document the destruction of the temple in AD 70, but yet with an eye still on the day of the Lord. However, in the next verse, Matthew heads straight to the time of the end, the events after the beginning of sorrow signs. Once you see this divergence of narrative, Luke before, Matthew after, the difference in the accounts is obvious and understandable. These are the 5 clear markers of the beginning of sorrows. Scoffers say, we've always had these things. Yes, that's true. But they'll increase in magnitude and frequency as the day of the Lord approaches. Like a woman in childbirth, the frequency and severity of her contractions increase as the birth approaches. And once the day of the Lord starts, these marker signs will explode. In this time of post-COVID panic, the sign of pestilence really jumps out at me. Pestilence, plague, disease. A relatively mild pandemic like COVID sent the world into disarray. It drove otherwise intelligent people to near madness. Revelation 6:12 mentions beasts being unleashed and participating in the widespread culling of 1/4 of humanity. This never really made sense to me, with most of humanity living in urban settings, until I heard a preacher preach the prospect maybe this was talking about microscopic beasts like viruses, plagues, and diseases. And when we connect the Jesus prediction about pestilence exploding as a key marker before the end, this makes perfect sense. So imagine COVID-19, but literally 200 times more deadly in the space of 2 or 3 months. Imagine the panic the world will descend into. COVID-19 is a baby bunny compared to the gigantic Jabberwocky of pestilence to be unleashed once we enter the day of the Lord. So let's recapitulate what I'm teaching. Jesus spoke to a larger group of people publicly in the temple. He told them about the beginning of sorrow signs. He tells them what will happen before these sorrow signs. And this is substantially what Luke records. So technically, Luke 21 is not the Olivet Discourse, rather the Temple Discourse. He tells them about the AD 70 Roman destruction of Jerusalem. He doesn't mention the abomination of desolation, as this didn't occur in AD 70. He doesn't mention the Great Tribulation. Again, this didn't relate to AD 70. And the generation he was referring to was the generation in his day. They would see the temple pulled down by Rome within a generation. After predicting the AD 70 events, then Jesus tells them about the final cosmic upheavals, followed by his second coming. Whereas here in Matthew 24, he talks of the beginning of sorrow signs. Then Jesus privately tells Inner Circle 4 what will happen after the beginning of sorrow signs. Only a select group of the original disciples were given a full and total insight into these eschatological events. And still today, amongst his disciples, it's only a select group of the church body that has a full and well-ordered insight into these eschatological events, with most in the church being wildly ignorant of these end times. This time of the famed 70th week of Daniel, the final 7 years before the second coming, Jesus talks of the abomination of desolation, a clear sign and signal marker that all good Jews would immediately understand. Sadly, the vast majority of the Gentile Christian world is totally clueless about the abomination of desolation. It's actually quite embarrassing and shameful to hear Christian teachers butcher this simple subject matter with all sorts of crazy allegorical renderings of what it is and when it happened. It's a clear signpost the second coming is imminent. The abomination of desolation will commence the 3.5-year Great Tribulation. And that generation in Matthew 24 is a generation that see the Revelation 6 beginning of sorrow signs. AD 70 and Daniel's 70th week do have some genuine common ground. This is classic apocalyptic writing, with prophecy that has near-term and far horizon fulfillments, a duplication of fulfillment, a partial fulfillment in the near term and a total outplaying in the far distant future. It's like a reflection in the nearby water, reflecting things a great distance away. Luke 21 is the near reflection. Matthew 24 is the distant reality. Luke 21 largely played out in the first century. Matthew 24 is in our future. The events described in Matthew 24 are ready to unfold today. All the bigger pieces are now in place for these events to occur. It's understandable why people mix up the Luke 21 and Matthew 24 narratives. They cover some very similar territory. Once you have a good grounding in these end times events, the Word of God truly comes to life. Roughly 30% of the Bible is prophetic. Until you deeply engage with prophecy, the Bible will always remain a mystery to you. But once you gain a grounding and a sound grounding in prophecy, I believe you're far more likely to be an effective servant of Christ. In the coming weeks, we'll look into these intriguing end-time events more deeply. We'll be investigating things like the rapture of the church. When will it occur? The abomination of desolation and when it will occur. We'll take a deeper look at the Antichrist and his wicked false prophet and some of their prophesied dastardly deeds. We'll look into the greatest tribulation in human history and when it will occur. We'll look into the mark of the beast and the battle of Armageddon and the glorious second coming of Jesus. I hope you'll join us in the following weeks to delve with us into these crucial and greatly misunderstood and largely neglected prophetic Bible truths. May God richly bless you.